from Vassar College. This is Conversations at the Salt Line with Wesley Dixon. On this episode, a conversation with Rihanna Gunright.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us again for another episode of Conversations at the Salt Line. I am your host, Wes, and I'm so happy to be joined today by Rihanna Gunright, who is a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and the architect of the Green New Deal. We'll talk about all that and more soon. Thanks for being here, Rihanna.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. You're wearing such nice, bright colors today. I'm very optimistic for how our conversation will go and the state of the country and the world because of your outfit.
Oh, thank you. I was mostly just trying to wake myself up.
I understand. I'm a morning person, so I didn't have that problem. But I'm sympathetic to those who...
Absolutely never a morning person.
Well, I'm then particularly grateful that you woke up to be here with us on the podcast this morning.
Truly an honor.
And second of all, welcome to Vassar.
Oh, thank you.
Of course. I know you've been here for a couple of days talking to all kinds of people. How's it been for you?
It's been really nice. Everyone's been very lovely, very warm. And it's just been exciting because I feel like I heard about Vassar. And it's always been in my mind like a fancy New England place. So it's nice to see it.
And actually be here.
Yeah, and actually be here. And also... I was able to go into Poughkeepsie a little, and that was nice. I found a great nail salon.
Well, I'm sure you did. There's actually a student on campus who is opening up an on-campus nail salon, nail tech business in her room. Her name is Cher. Shout out to Cher. And it's super
That's
cool.
Brilliant.
Yeah, she's amazing. It's cool too because you're in Poughkeepsie, you're at Vassar, and the region, if you don't know, it's called the Hudson Valley. And as you may or may not know, the Hudson Valley is home to FDR and the Roosevelt family.
Yes.
So it's so cool, sort of given a portion of your life's work, of course, with the Green New Deal being here at Vassar, which has such strong connections to the Roosevelts and to FDR and the New Deal programs themselves, many of which were born here at FDR's time in New York. How do you feel about that?
I mean, it's exciting. I was just at Hyde Park.
Yes.
Like a month ago.
Oh, cool.
For a Roosevelt event. And it's always interesting, I think, to see the places where stuff that you hear about happen.
Yeah.
Because it always reminds me like, oh, this was a real place with real people, right? That FDR was a real person.
Right. He's not a legend or a myth.
Yeah. And, there's things like one of his Roosevelt Institute was founded in part by parts of the Roosevelt family and is connected to the Presidential Library. And so at that event, I met, one of the Roosevelts. And it's very also... she looked so much like Eleanor.
Oh, wow.
So it's like you're seeing a face that you've seen in pictures, but in front of you. And it's just such a reminder that all of these things that we often talk about in ways that, because they are big and historical, are still very human and very, I don't know, tactile.
Yeah.
It's just, even just seeing her face, oh, that was a real person. Eleanor Roosevelt was a real person in one body who had kids that then had kids, right?
Of course.
I just think that aspect of it is really grounding.
I agree. I didn't tell you this, but I used to sit on the board of the Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Valkill. And to your point, some of our board members were kin to Eleanor and FDR. And there's many of them, obviously. It's sort of it's sort of like Berry Gordy's family tree. It's all over the place. Yeah. This is very similar. But one of the granddaughters who's on the board with me, wonderful, wonderful woman, and hearing her talk about, she was alive and spent time with Eleanor, right? And so hearing her talk about her time with Eleanor was so beautiful. In particular, Eleanor's friendship with Pauli Murray, which most people don't know about, but they had a really close friendship.
Yes.
And hearing this particular family member talk about that from a firsthand experience was so magical and just so
That's amazing.
Beautiful. It was cool.
I'm jealous because I'm obsessed with Pauli Murray.
Well, we'll talk. We'll have to keep talking about it. She's incredible.
Yes.
Side note for those listening, Rihanna and I have another connection that's relevant to Polly Murray and to us, but we both are Yaleys. I know it's hard to say that on a Vassar podcast, but we both went to Yale.
Is there beef?
Well, not really. Actually, there shouldn't be beef. They're also sisters and kin too. You know, Vassar
Right.
and Yale
Used to
almost
be-
sort of
you're right.
almost joined. But you know, it's a little fun competition because
yeah.
Vassar sort of rebuffed Yale's offer, and so there's a little bit of beef there. But it is what it is. But for those who don't know, Polly Murray is the name of a new residential college at Yale.
Yeah.
So the world all comes full circle.
Yeah.
It's super cool. The other cool Vassar connection relevant to environmental work and climate change is actually the Student Conservation Association was founded here by a Vassar student in 1957.
Oh.
Yeah, it's so cool. And actually the student it was a woman, the student who founded the SCA modeled it after Roosevelt's CCC.
Oh.
And so there's this rich history of environmental sort of activism and advocacy and sort of public service right here at Vassar and Hudson Valley. So it's just super exciting to have you here in this place, sort of continuing the legacy of Vassar being a place of really meaningful conversations about important work around environmentalism. So thank you for joining that legacy.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you. Now, before we get into the meat of our conversation, I did hear you say before in a different conversation that before you sort of began this life of policy and environment and climate change advocacy and work, that your goal earlier in life was to be the editor-in-chief of Vibe magazine.
Very much. So.
Love that.
Yeah. I have been drawn to writing since I was a kid.
Yeah.
And I wrote a lot as a kid, and I knew, you know, people ask you what you want to do, and after I had cycled through, you know, the usual, I want to be an actress, I want to be a ballerina, I want to be president. I was like, well, what do I want to do? And I was like, I think I want to do something that has to do with stories and writing. But I knew very quickly I was not going to do fiction. Those people are sorcerers, wizardry. I don't understand.
Yeah.
And I was like, I remember attempting even to write a short story, and I was like, this is exhausting. I have to figure out what everybody says and what, I was just like, this is too much. But I was like, well, another way I could do it is just to tell stories that just exist. Right. And so then I got really interested in journalism. And this is going to age me, but I loved hip hop. And I don't remember how old I was, middle school age. A movie called Brown Sugar came out, which is a classic. Sanaa Lathan, Taye Diggs, watch it if you haven't. And she gets a job as editor of The Source in the movie. And I was a big fan of Danielle Smith, who is a music journalist. And I had by that time been like, I think I want to be a music journalist, right? Like I would like to write. I loved reading music reviews. I loved reading artist profiles. I just really enjoyed that. And seeing that movie, I was like, well, if Danielle Smith can be editor of Vibe and Sanaa Lathan could be editor
and so can Rihanna Gunright.
So can I. And I was like, yes, I want to be editor-in-chief of Vibe magazine. And that was truly my dream and goal. Through high school, like into college. And really the thing that changed it was that Vibe got sold.
Yes, that
and
happened.
shuttered. Yes. And I was like,
there goes that potential job.
There go. And it's so funny. This is how set I was on one thing. My mom was like, there are other magazines. I was like, disgusting.
Like,
absolutely
don't want to hear it.
I don't want to run Rolling Stone. So that change, and with that shift, that opened up a lot because I was like, well, that's that. And by that time, I knew people who worked on the school newspaper, and I decided I didn't want to do that.
Yeah.
Because it was so consuming.
Yeah.
Right? Like that was the thing that you did. You don't do anything
Right.
else but go to class and work on the newspaper. And then I think that is what sort of freed me up to eventually end up in policy.
I love that.
Yeah.
There seems to be a through line. I've heard you talk before in other conversations about policy as sort of not quite narrative making, but it sort of shapes the narratives that we either acknowledge that are existing currently, and or also start to project us towards a narrative that we want to be realized soon. So it seems to me your storytelling aspirations have not gone away.
No.
And in fact, your work in policy probably has fed this real nonfiction storytelling part of your life. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. I talk about, so there's like 3 things about the way that I talk about policy that I feel like tend to be different or not the way people usually talk about it. One is I'll talk about it being very much about emotion, right? Because like we were talking about earlier with the Roosevelts, all of these things that feel even abstract are grounded in actual people. Both actual people are making these decisions and then actual people are receiving them, right? And so there's always a social and emotional aspect to policy making and also the reception that policy comes with. And you'll see it often on the right. A lot of their policy ideas are very tied to issues that they have constructed to draw a lot of emotion out of people, right? And so I just think that's really important to remember, because I think also often, particularly for folks who might be more progressive, there's a tendency to think about policy change just as fact, right? You just need to tell people the facts. You just need to give them more evidence. And you're like, evidence doesn't move people, right? Even if a fact is strong and you think it presents a story on itself, it doesn't, right? And so that's one thing. The other thing that I always talk about it as is collective problem solving. And I think that is always important to ground people in, because again, along with the evidence, sometimes there's a sense that like, not that policy is a science, but that, these things are complicated, and so some smart people somewhere, some other place will figure it out.
Figure this out.
And then they'll tell us, and I'm like, that's just not how any of this works, because in line with narrative, all policy change generally starts far beyond the time where it meets a technocrat, right? And so even to get something to a stage where people want to think about it seriously when it comes to a policy idea, you have to have done a lot before, right? Like people have to know about the problem. People have to agree
on the problem.
that it's a problem or what the stakes of the problem are, what the shape of the problem is. There has to be some understanding, again, a story of what caused the problem.
And an agreement on that too.
And that's the scuffling around what caused the problem is really important, because whatever that narrative is definitely going to shape what people think of as an acceptable solution to that problem, right? So just even thinking about immigration, for instance, or the climate crisis, right? One of the reasons we didn't do much on it as a country for a long time is because, in particular, fossil fuel companies did a really good job of muddying the waters when it came to one, establishing climate change as a problem, but two, around saying who was responsible, right? So they were very good at sort of being like, well, maybe it's not people, maybe it's just how the weather changes, even though they knew differently. But right, when you even think about climate change, until you can say people caused it, you can't really do anything about it, right? Because if it's just an act of nature, or if it's just weather changes all the time, then there's no need to actually do anything about it. And so I think often, again, with policy, people just think of like, I'm just a bill, which I did for a long time. And so it starts at the point there's a bill. But if you do that, essentially you're only ever going to really be able to do reactionary policy, because you're always going to be building stuff based on what is the existing narrative about what is causing this, who's causing it, which all feeds into how people think you should do something about it, the sort of
Yeah.
approach that you should take. And so those stories are really important because also policy is a political process, just in some ways. Like, I mean, small p political is not like
Yeah.
people vote necessarily on every policy decision, but political in the sense that it is about building a coalition that's going to have the power to actually make that policy idea more popular, put pressure on people to adopt it. And a lot of that has to do with storytelling, because particularly if it's something that is not in line with the status quo, you're going to need more public support. And if the story isn't compelling about what's going on, why this is a good idea, how your life will change and hopefully get better because of this decision, it's very hard to get attention.
Yeah.
And not because people are stupid, people are busy.
Yeah.
And I do think that storytelling aspect, particularly as people continue to be inundated with so much information and also have to do so much labor to keep themselves afloat, to keep their families afloat.
Yeah.
The importance of storytelling when it comes to policy and narrative building is only going to get more important.
Understood. Thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit more about climate policy in particular. And we'll start off with the Green New Deal, but there's, of course, many other materializations of this. So you architected that policy, of course,
with
I'm sure with other people,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
It's never a singular effort. But it's funny hearing you just talk about sort of trying to get away from this sort of reactionary approach to policymaking, right? The Green New Deal strikes me as something that was both sort of proactive and visionary, but also reactive, right?
Yeah.
Because we were experiencing
Yeah.
a climate crisis and have been for some periods of time, right? So I just would love to get in your head about what sort of motivated you as you were crafting this policy with your team. What was in your head driving sort of the principles that you use to sort of think about what would be the teeth in that policy, and just sort of open that box for us as a starting point.
Well, I think the Green New Deal that's an interesting example, because when I came on, the Green New Deal has been an idea that's taken various forms. Right. In the last, I would say, like 2 to 3 decades. And by the time we came in, there was both a Green New Deal proposal that was from a think tank in the UK. It came out not long after the global financial crisis, that really focused on investment in clean energy, and addressing the climate crisis, but really took a strong stance. Their lens was financialization.
Got it.
Right? Like, what is the role of big banks, the same sort of actors who got us into this global financial crisis? How are they driving the climate crisis, and how do we sort of do things that both hold them more accountable so that they aren't behaving in the ways that help cause the crisis, but also are helping to reduce emissions and pull us off of this path that we're on. And then, of course, there's also the Green Party Green New Deal version of the Green New Deal that came out in 2016, but also the think tank that hired me. So I say that to say, like, there's sort of already some values and vision sketched out for what a Green New Deal is that inform the folks who came to me wanting me to work on a Green New Deal. So they already, in addition to, being influenced to some extent by those proposals before, came with their own set of values, right? That they wanted me to help them design a Green New Deal based on. And 2 of those values were around creating jobs, addressing racial justice. I think at the beginning it was like the goals at the end of the Green New Deal, there would be 0 racial wealth gap. And I was like, I don't know how I could give you that. And then I think maybe something about 0 waste, right? But and And so we went from that vision and tried to hold on to the values behind some of that, right? Racial justice, a commitment to equity, to really designing with justice at the center. Something I thought about when I worked on it throughout was like, how would this affect communities like the one I grew up in? And broader than that, like, I tried to design, and this is maybe other people who work in policy think differently. I have a background in part where I worked on user experience design in like a ed tech startup. But I think this is the case in general, which is like you're often designing policy with somebody or something in mind. That's how it works for me. And so I tried really hard to make the user, quote unquote, in my mind, low income Black or brown person.
Right.
And also trying to think about how do we address these problems without sacrificing, the same communities that we always sacrifice. Because once you take that off of the table, your solution set changes. Right. So thinking about that constantly in my mind, as we were working on the Green New Deal, and then really trying to stay true to a set of values, right? I think one thing that I'm proud of in the Green New Deal was that it was a very clearly values-based approach to a particular problem. And I'm proud of that because I think showing people, at least to some extent, that you can address a set of problems, this set of problems that up till then we have been told we just need to do a carbon tax or whatever, through a different set of policies that are grounded in a different set of values was important. But I also am very proud that we were upfront about it because every policy is guided by values.
They might be hidden or unspoken, but
they're there, right? And they might not even be consciously thought about, but they're still there. And so along with that, I mean, we work closely with Representative Ocasio-Cortez and her team. So the values very much really were about justice, about how do we create jobs and prosperity, but in a way that is based on what some people call like the real economy, actually making things, actually creating things, not financialization. And then a lot of it was also about how do we actually treat this as an economic mobilization, and grounds for transforming some of the things that we do need to shift in our country, particularly when it comes to social policy. How do we use this to build a better social safety net? And a lot of people were like, that you're trying to Trojan horse it, whatever. You're attaching these things that have nothing to do with climate to climate. But we did that because we were just trying to grapple with the fact and that transitioning from fossil fuels to clean energy is in fact a transformation. It is an economic transformation. You do have to still encounter all of these questions about who owns what, where do we put things, like who should have power over these decisions. And we just thought, if you're going to have this transformation anyway, where are the opportunities
to do it better
and to change the way that we are doing things, because we're going to have to be changing anyway. And so I think like all of those values were things that were important to me. Some of them I brought in, but a lot of them already existed.
Yeah, that's super helpful. One thing that struck me as you were talking, but strikes me continuously, is that when I hear people who are informed and educated and thoughtful about the climate crisis, such as yourself, it's very clear that there is a time horizon sort of controlling or influencing, that should be influencing rather, the speed and magnitude at which we make the changes that the Green New Deal proposed that we would make, for example, right? And as a citizen, or rather as a resident, a person, a human living in the world and in this country, I keep hearing the narratives about like the urgency that we need, but I experience the slowness and the lethargy with which we act, right?
Yes.
And it's like dissonant for me to hear and experience both of those things, right? It's
Yes.
sort of like the salt lines we explore in this podcast. Like, we're facing urgency, but we're experiencing apathy or lethargy, right? And I can't make sense of, like, does that mean that I'm walking towards an imminent death relative to the, you know what I mean? Because there's these competing narratives,
right,
and then competing experiences, right? So how do you, as someone who's so deep in it, so aware, so cognizant of the urgency for us to change and make transformations, live with the fact that arguably we're not, like today, making, like on a societal level, those kinds of transformation at the speed at which we need to in 2030 or 2040 keep ticking closer and closer? How do we grapple with that?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, my ADHD helps. I just rarely think about time. It's too big for me. It's above me. But that's a little bit of how I treat it. In a little bit, like, it's above me now, because in part the way that I deal with it is that, like, every day I just have to do the work to make this stuff more possible. But the timeline that it happens on, I don't have control over that. You know, and my work is to, like, help make clear the urgency, help make clear that we have a variety of options. And that particularly if we are not invested and don't continue to invest in these hierarchies of value, white supremacy, patriarchy, et cetera, that keep us locked into, right, a certain, that keep our systems locked into place in a certain way because they have to help maintain these hierarchies, right. Then we can address these problems in ways that are far more effective and far less harmful. Like, to me, I just have to keep doing that work every day, because the question of when it will happen, that's beyond me, if that makes sense. But it is very dissonant, and I also see urgency used in, like, ways to sort of step away from justice, right? And to insist that, like, an expedience. Yeah, an expedience. We have to do this no matter the cost. However, right. We have to do it. If some people suffer, then, you know, that's unfortunate. But, right, so I see urgency used in that way too. So it is dissonant on a lot of levels. And I think also my reaction is slow, just having worked around or within government for a while. Bureaucracies are slow, but I also, some of the slowness in terms of taking a time to try to make a good decision, that's helpful, right? So it's also a lot of push and pull, because right. There are times where you do want to take a bit more time to build the right coalition, to build trust, right? To get the right voices, to be thoughtful and try to make sure that you're making a choice that right. is going to be a good choice. There's everything happening at the fastest speed it can is not always great. Even as you have these time horizons that are very real, because in particular, because they affect so many people beyond our borders who will face that onslaught much more quickly. It will be much more deadly. And so I try to remind myself too, it's hard to hold in my head though, to some things need to be slow, but at the same time, we cannot be stealing other people's lives in order to make this transition more comfortable for us, right? Or to make it more possible, because our systems are so slow. And so I don't know, it's like a weird balancing act. Yeah, it's just a gray space where, like, lots of things are true. And one thing that does help is sometimes I also have to remember that, like, time is constant, but sometimes I also think that time isn't linear, in the sense that you can warp time. Like, if you build trust, things can go faster.
Gotcha.
Right? If there is trust, right? Even if it's slow to build trust, I'm often like, well, once you build that trust, things could go faster, right? And so I'm trying to often like also do things that like help build that trust, things that even if we're in this sort of gray area right now that maybe could help us speed up later.
There's like invisible ink progress happening that we don't really see, but it's definitely there.
Yeah.
It's hard to quantify or materialize, but it's necessary for us to be able to do what we want to do.
Exactly. And so, I don't know, that is how, but it's really hard to square, because I really don't want to get into a situation where like I'm comfortable with things going slow because I'm not thinking about who it costs because they're not in front of me.
Right.
And I remember that's something that kind of shocked me when I worked on the Green New Deal is, you know, we would be saying things like we need to, do this economic mobilization in 10 years. We need to be aiming for 2030. And, a lot of people would say like, that's not physically possible, et cetera, et cetera. And they had some points for real. But the idea was like, even if we can't hit 2030, we need to be, right. And we have to be taking seriously our role because it's affecting other people. But the number of folks who, again, just based purely on technical knowledge, like, that's not true. We can't do that. We can't do anything sooner than 2050. Like, that's the goal. And when you would say like, what about, other people in the global south, it would be sort of like a shrug.
Like, well, that's not our problem.
Yeah.
Effectively is what they're saying.
Yeah. And I do think like, again, it's just hard because those technical barriers exist. And like, yeah, we probably couldn't have done it in 10 years, right? But I think that comes back to narrative. When it comes to policy and recognizing that part of policy is in fact much more like a political campaign than a science experiment, right? So like, yes, you might be saying a target that you can't reach, and you don't want to do that in a way that's bad faith, but also you need to be setting up a goal maybe that's aggressive, that even if you can't meet it based on the current science, it's letting people know these are the stakes. This is what could be lost, right? And this is what will be lost for other people. Yeah. So that's a long way of saying, girl, I don't know.
You seem like you do know, but you have a level of dissonance that I think is shared, right?
Yeah.
And we're trying to grapple with. It's interesting. You introduced into our conversation sort of the loss or the cost of others who may not be visible to us, broadly defined, right? And I've heard you say before that in some ways, like, this renewable economy, this renewable energy that we sort of, in some ways, aspire to have more of and grow its sort of market share, if you will, right, is also extractive in ways, right? And I think you said, and others said, there's often a green halo that surrounds lots of things labeled as sustainable or climate change friendly or whatever else, right? So it's sort of breaking down this Pollyanna kind of perspective of this work. And it's so important, I think, for us to harp on that a little more, right? Because I think we really see all these efforts as necessarily beneficial without always recognizing that there are oftentimes extractive, sort of subjugating effects of that work. Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, totally. So like you said, and I will talk about, there is often a green halo around clean and renewable energy or other things that are labeled quote unquote green. That means that we don't necessarily ask the same questions or apply the same scrutiny that we do with fossil fuels. And on some level that makes sense, right? They are less extractive. They are, particularly in operation, a lot less harmful. Solar panels do not emit toxic air pollution, right? So I understand why people sort of have initially are like, oh, it has a lower bar. But all of these technologies have pros and cons, right? When you're talking about solar panels and batteries, you're also talking about mining. It requires mining. And I think, again, going back to questions of power, Just because it's renewable energy, you can't ignore that like companies have a profit motive, right? That some of the same um trends of consolidation, right, of monopoly, right, that those can come back with
Right.
renewables, and that when we are investing in this industry, we also still need to be thinking about how is this industry going to be structured, who's going to have power, how are they treating their
Right.
laborers, right? It's gotten a lot better, especially because of the IRA, that more say work on solar is unionized. But like when we started, the union levels were
Right.
right in solar, and some of the pay was right. And so just because it's green, you can't be like, well, it doesn't really matter how you pay your workers if they have option or access to unions.
Right.
Right. And similarly, I think you have to take that stance with the actual material costs, right? What it takes to build these technologies. Battery factories can still be emitting pollution and toxic waste, right? Solar panels still require lithium. EVs still require
The
lithium.
cobalt mining in the Congo.
Cobalt mining, right?
All
And
these things.
and I think we're in this place, like for me, my approach to it is like, if this is what these technologies need, yes, sometimes we're going to have that extraction, but what are the grounds of that extraction is happening on? How are people being treated? How are workers being treated, right? Like, how do we ensure that the countries that actually have those resources, that they are like, the agreements that we're having are on much more equal footing. We're not exploiting them in a colonial way, right? Because I think sometimes the conversation devolves to like extraction bad, so we can't do anything with extraction. Right. And I think we have to like stay more grounded, I don't want to say in reality, but the reality that we need these things, and also we don't have to accept the conditions
it seems
that
like
it's happening under. And also, how do we minimize that extraction too, right? Like, yes, we need to shift away from internal combustion engine vehicles, but is the answer replace every single car with an EV, right? There's a I'm also a fellow at another think tank, the Climate and Community Project. And one of their first reports was this amazing report where they literally modeled different scenarios of like essentially different shares of transportation so that you could reduce emissions. You could also to some extent minimize the impact, right, of lifestyle changes, right? People in rural areas are not going to be getting on buses, right? There's not the infrastructure for that. But also, where are there places where we can increase the amount of public transit, right? So that we are balancing all of these things in a way that minimizes to the extent the extraction needed. Because the fact is, we want to change the conditions under which this mining is happening, but that's not happening right now. And there are very few models of like just sustainable mining, right? So even as we're working to change those structures, we know that's not the case right now. So we do also need to try to minimize the amount, right? And I think it's that approach to these questions that I'm most drawn to, right? Because there will be cons. None of these technologies are going to be all pros all day. So how do we both make sure that as they're getting integrated and growing, that we're not going to just create markets that repeat the same problems that we have now? And how are we changing the structures under which extraction is happening, and also how are we minimizing?
That makes perfect sense. And it seems like in some ways what you're describing is a move from extraction, sort of in the purest sense of the meaning of that word, to like a mutually beneficial partnership, right? In which extraction is not the feeling or the experience those on the other side are experiencing, right? They're actually getting some benefit from whatever this arrangement is, right? That doesn't make it feel extractive, right? And it isn't actually extractive. And that's, I think, a worthwhile vision to have.
Yeah.
And an honest thing to acknowledge may not currently exist.
That doesn't exist. And also to sort of try to separate to the extent possible the types of extraction. Right? Because even under a just fair partnership, you're still extracting
Right.
minerals, right, literally from the earth. And I think we need to do that because we have gotten ourselves into like quite a conundrum.
Right.
But we need to do that, but also recognizing so that extraction from the earth still matters. So are there ways to do that so that extraction is minimally harmful? That we are sort of rehabilitating those areas at a certain point.
Right.
Do we need to extract till there's nothing left? Right? Like, so there's also, I think you have to separate the different types of extraction. You're extracting from people,
Right.
you're extracting from land, right? And each of those things can require a different approach.
Yeah. I think it's also super helpful for me and for others listening to hear someone in this space be frank about the fact that environmental work and climate change work is not a purist exercise, right? Because I think but it can feel that way, right? I think people feel and experience individuals who are in their own lives sustainability advocates, climate advocates. It feels like I can't even engage with you because if I'm one iota imperfect, you're not going to accept me into the fold, and I can't. There's no space for me in this work, right? But that's not the case, right?
No.
We all are sort of in this world. We have no choice but to accept imperfect actions to try to get it to a better place.
Yes,
right?
Because we're all enmeshed in these same systems. Like, it doesn't matter how much I dislike capitalism, and I dislike it very much, I'm still in a capitalist society, right? And so, yeah, I think it's really incumbent to remove that desire for perfection. That doesn't mean you can't hold people accountable and you can't say, actually, this way of engaging, this set of solutions is not really a solution or it's harmful or whatever. You can do that while also acknowledging that, like, it's messy. Like, it's just messy, both because of the nature of the systems that we're working in as we are attempting to change, because of the way that all of these systems we have been socialized within them, right? And it's very hard to see outside of them. And, so we can unthinkingly sort of reify this stuff, but all of it, everybody's compromised.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I've heard you say, as you've reflected previously on your work on the Green New Deal, is that many of the sort of ideas or innovations in the Green New Deal were things that you and your team saw initially on sort of local or state levels, these sort of very localized, sort of undiscovered at the time innovations that were really exciting and motivating to you all. And I'm curious if you can reflect on a couple of those examples of things you saw in whatever it was, small towns, state governments, whatever it was, that you felt like this should be scaled. This is a sort of unhidden or undiscovered gem that people need to think about more.
Well, I know one thing that struck me was sustainable agriculture, right? A lot of the knowledge about how to do agriculture more sustainably is happening on a smaller scale, right? When you think about the way that our food is grown, it's largely it's very corporate, right? And those entities have very little interest in doing sustainable agriculture. So what we do know and how people are doing it is coming from individual farmers, is coming from indigenous knowledge, is coming from, communities who are committed to growing and being in relationship to the land and the earth in a particular way. And so that's an example of something that, like, I didn't know that is not happening on a large scale, but that we were trying to point to and say, hey, we should do more of this. We should figure out how to scale this up. We should figure out how to get the resources necessary, right? To do that, because agriculture is like a huge issue when it comes to emissions, when it comes to toxic waste, right? Especially in water. And is one of the things that I think often gets overlooked in climate. And so that is an example of that. And then for me, and this happened a little into when we were working on the Green New Deal, learning from community groups. I can't remember, there's one in Boston. They do like community economics. I wish I could remember the name. But or even like We Act in New York, right? You would see EJ groups have a different, like, there's a principles of environmental justice, and some of those principles are quite literally about how do you engage and make decisions. And that was really, really informative to me, because the longer I've been in this work, and even as I was starting into the Green New Deal, once it was out and we're talking about it, you realize how much of what comes out of policy and creating a context of sort of like democratic, if not control, input into policy making has to do with how you engage. And really, they taught me so much about essentially like, how do you make decisions through consensus? How do you try to create cooperation and come to a common goal without coercion? And I think that has like really shaped my work since, because part of, I think, to me, getting to the climate policy that we need is allowing and having more democratic control over small d democratic control, ways of people speaking into and shaping what happens in their community, because you even see it with like the permitting issues over renewables, right? There is a really big issue even with people like renewable energy. In theory, that messiness, those cons come into place. Oh, now you want to build transmission in my rural community where I have always, part of our characters that were agrarian, and now this land will be used. And what do these solar panels mean? Like, what, all of these sort of issues, what it brings up to me is that, one, we have a lot, even if people like the technologies in general, once the rubber hits the road, we have a lot more work to do in building social license for that and trust and belief. But another part is what we're seeing in response to people sort of being taken aback and not being sure if they want these in their community, is what you're seeing is people are responding by saying, well, we should cut off their ability to have a say. Right? We should change these laws. We should tighten the amount of time that they have to file suit, right? Like, we should, have ways to get around them. And while, again, that might make sense on a short-term expediency, long-term, what does that mean? And to me, that speaks to an impoverishment of tools, right? Because those tools that they're using is what they've been using on Black people. Right, when they built highways through our communities, et cetera, right? That is the way that they did it. Of course, people weren't happy. They were protesting, right? But essentially, take away their ability to say anything. And now we're using it on communities who have more social and political power. It's not working out the same way, right? Who are actively being courted by the right in a way that they will never do for Black communities, right? And again, people need to believe in this. So even if it's makes sense in the short term, you risk long-term backlash, you miss, right? And so the fact that we're going to that so quickly, and that so many in folks who work in climate and energy are like willing to make that trade-off, to me says like, okay, actually the skills that we have about how do we, even when there's opposition, come to a decision, even if people don't like it. How do we build a process where they feel respected and heard? Right? How do we build formal channels for them to be involved? How do we sort of create more space to do some of this work, or like to build some of these things in other places that right now are unaffordable to be built in, right? But that people wouldn't have as much sort of issue with, right? There's all of these things where I'm like, oh, we have an impoverishment of skills.
Yeah, absolutely.
We don't know how to do this. And that is part of what is getting in the way. And I feel, in my experience, the people who've done the most thinking about how do you do that is environmental justice folks. How do you get people who might not understand something on board? How do you build validators from within the community, right? How do you approach this? Because people also think often, EJ, they must all agree because they're all Black. That's not how that works.
Sure.
Right? And so I just think that has shaped my work a lot, because I do think sort of part of the next frontier of climate work is figuring out how do we have these conversations and how do we build decision-making processes that are much more cooperative.
Absolutely.
And respectful.
It's so funny when you started by talking about sort of these local practices and sort of agriculture work that are inherently sustainable in ways that were not scaled. I couldn't help but think about my grandmother who grew up in Mississippi, and I would see her during the summertime. And of course, at that age, I didn't have any language for what sustainability was or whatever, but she was doing things that were so sustainable, right? Like everything and whatever livestock she had got used, right?
Yeah.
Nothing went to waste. Like she would make lice. So, I mean, it was just so cool to me at the time to see like how there was like no waste, and that came from a place of necessity, right? She didn't have the money to be able to waste things, right? But that spirit, I think, is similar to the spirit you're talking about in terms of finding those kinds of practices where there are small scale sustainable things you can do that if we could scale them corporately would be amazing.
Right. And like even another thing that I think about often, even when it comes to permitting, is planning. And you see the type of sort of community minded planning often happening not at necessarily a state level, but like a sub-state level. Occasionally it happens on the state level. Because like, again, I'm talking about the importance of democratic decision making. But I do also think that we also need to be thinking often about what parts of this decision making do we want to pull up, not because people aren't equipped, but because we can't dump everything on them, be like, figure all of this out, you know? So where is an appropriate place for us to say, actually, a different collective, in this case, the government, or, you know, some sort of more formal committee needs to be responsible for this, and then local communities need to be responsible for this, but in a way that is sympathetic, respectful, and isn't about like pulling up the ladder so that they don't have a say, but more about, okay, what is appropriate and healthiest for everybody involved.
Absolutely. So for those listening, lest they think that there's been no sort of movement on climate change, despite the Green New Deal not being passed, quote unquote, right? You mentioned the IRA earlier, for those who don't know, the Inflation Reduction Act. And of course it's imperfect, as we've discussed already. All things are imperfect, right? But maybe this is a hard way to frame the question for you, but I'm curious, if you had to sort of give a percentage in terms of what percent of the way towards the new Green Deal the IRA represents, right? What range of percent would you place it?
20, maybe 30.
Okay, that's scary.
Well, because
no. I mean, I don't mean to. I'm not blaming you. But I would say right, but
I would say 30. But again, other people might differ, right? And it depends on how you judge different things, right? So the IRA made a big leap in terms of embracing industrial policy, public investment, saying that like the growth of clean industries, the government should take an active role in that. The government should, in fact, enable the growth and support the growth very actively of clean and renewable energy and related manufacturing. And that was a big part of the Green New Deal, right? Like that was one of the big things that we were pushing, that you can't just wait on a carbon tax, right? That government has to get involved. This is not going to be addressed unless the government is, in fact, playing a far more active role across the board, including by just paying for this stuff, right? And so that is a big shift. And lots of people would say, you know, I could see other people being like, it's 50, right? Because it is such a big shift. It is really a break with neoliberalism in lots of ways. In some ways it's not, right? We're still using tax credits and whatnot. And, you know, and that is what it is because of the nature of what that bill was and how it had to be passed. But I say 30% because even if that is happening, a lot of the Green New Deal was about changing power relationships, coming from the vantage point of the climate crisis is fueled by inequity. It is fueled by white supremacy. It is fueled and the ways that enables endless extraction, right? The way that you know enables us to keep using fossil fuels despite how poisonous they are, because there's always people you can put it off on, right? Just the ways in which colonialism, right, these systems have allowed the growth of an energy system and economies, right, that are so brutal in some ways. And I do think the IRA, there's some exceptions, right? You have direct pay so that public entities can now be taking advantage of it, so of the same tax credits that private entities that are building clean energy would. And that's really great because it does mean that there's a chance for more public ownership, right? You have basically the first green bank, national green bank, that will be created, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and a vast, I want to say 80%, but I might be getting it wrong, but the vast majority of that money has to go to traditionally marginalized communities, with an emphasis on frontline communities, right? Like, those are structurally different, but in a lot of ways, the IRA doesn't really think about power, and doesn't do much to interrupt those power relationships. And again, other people might differ, but to me, that is a fundamental part of it. And so if the IRA is not addressing those, and for the most part it doesn't, then and there's also just a lot of, the IRA really focuses on clean energy, which is important, but there's, the climate crisis touches so much more. So there's like very little in there about agriculture, ecosystem restoration, right? Like, resilience. We're still not thinking about resettlement, right? There are places that might not be livable, right? How do we do that? We know what happened in New Orleans. We can't have that happening at scale where communities are being displaced, right? It's where disaster capitalism is happening, and gentrifying areas, and people can't return to their homes, right? So there's still so much to do, and again, so much that's made more difficult if you aren't addressing power, or sort of making structural interventions along with giving money.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear you. So I want to transition our conversation towards the end, and we have a couple of questions from some students. I know you met some students last night. You're meeting more today. But they submitted a couple of questions that I wanted to ask before we transition off. So the first is, if you weren't working on climate as a primary policy issue, what would your other quote unquote preferred issue to work on be?
I started out working on welfare policy, and I think I would be working on more social safety net-ish stuff. But also, since the Green New Deal, I've had to work on economics more, and economic policy. I can't ever see myself doing that full time, because economists love some of you, but they're also very exhausting sometimes. So probably welfare policy, or childcare.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And the last question, I'll just do two today, is how do you remain hopeful about living in the world that we live in?
I don't. But as we were talking about this last night, I don't, because I don't think of hope as a prerequisite or a necessity. So
prerequisite to
doing the work, or to thinking about these things. So it's less that I'm not hopeful, as I just don't care. I don't think about whether I feel hopeful or not.
You just do.
Yeah, because we're going to face, the problem is going to exist no matter whether I feel hopeful about it or not. And so I feel like I just have to do what I can to try to address it, because I just think, like, the outcome of this fight is not up to me, right? But some things you have to do whether you're going to win or not. And that's just where I am. The thing that actually, if I do feel hope that stirs it, is two things. One, having my child, and not just my love for him, but having him made me realize, it just made me look at people differently, because when you realize that everyone is someone's child, and that the depth of love that I have for him, somebody could potentially have for that person, is, to me, really just drove home like why it's so important to try to honor everyone, to like step away from these systems that say that some of us are disposable. Right. And then when I see what people are willing to do for their children, I feel really hopeful. And that always reminds me of like COVID. I remember people often talk about how COVID made them like despair about people. And I get that, right? Because some people were really
out of pocket,
acting out. But I also remember how much care people showed, right? The way folks would shop for elderly neighbors, the uptick in mutual aid, right? Like the way people, like in New York, would stand and like clap.
Bang the pots or whatever, yeah.
Right? And like clap when they would see doctors or nurses going in. And I don't know, to me, it was actually like a time of so much communal care, of seeing people try to care for one another. And that makes me hopeful, because I do think for so many people, they do really care about other people, even if that community isn't as wide as I would hope it is. Right. They do care, and they do not want to harm other people. They don't want to see bad things happen to folks, and they don't want to be part of that or be responsible for that happening to other people. And I am really moved by that. And so I think what makes me hopeful is actually really recognizing that the body of our country is on the whole a lot more empathetic and kind than our leaders. Yeah. And that what we see at the top, or even what we see in election season, or even what we see on the right, is very much not a full reflection, and to me, not an accurate reflection of how most people want to conduct themselves in relationship to other people.
You talked yourself into hope. I just want to acknowledge that you started off being pessimistic, and I'm just going to acknowledge
I'm not
that when
pessimistic.
Given space, you can talk yourself into a place of hope, which I'm very grateful and appreciative for. And truthfully, your reflections are just so helpful and so needed, and I think humanize everybody in ways that we need more of, thankfully.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think at the risk of sounding grandiose, I think if other policymakers and people working in policy had the spirit that you had about it and the values you had about it, we can be confident that we're going into a better place as a group of people, as a nation, as a society. And so I'm hopeful after having talked to you and knowing the people that you work with and work around, that we're on the way to a better society.
Yeah, and because the thing is also, people want better. It's expressed in sometimes really nasty ways, but the brunt even of MAGA, right, is people who want the world to be different because they want to feel, even if it's based in hatred, they're trying to meet some sort of need for safety, community inclusion, right? Even if it's going in really nasty ways, and knowing that those needs still exist, even in people that might seem really hateful. Yeah. I guess that gives me hope, actually.
Wonderful. Oriana, thank you so much. Our time was relatively short. We could keep talking forever, but thank you for joining us today for this conversation. And thank you all for tuning in for another episode of Conversations at the Salt Line. See you next time.